Hello all. I've been asked by many people for an update to the last summary I did of the data and science and facts around our viral issue. It's been a few weeks, so here is the crucial update. I'm going to start with the curves for deaths per million for many European countries, Italy, UK, Ireland, Sweden, and as you can see, they're all very similar in shape. And the epidemic largely ended around May, early June, and now we're down to very low levels. And this is entirely in line with influenza epidemics in the past. So I'm going to show that Europe, the average here is similar shape, of course, and there were some countries with lesser impacts. We're going to show you why shortly. So there's Europe. The important thing to note is that as per Professor Michael Levitt, in the northern temperate regions like Europe or North America, Northeast, you get a Gompertz curve. And the reason is because the virus, when it comes in new, it rapidly hits around 20% of the population. So around 80%, it's becoming clear, are already de facto immune through cross-immunity, T-cell, mucosal immunity from prior coronavirus in the large family of coronaviruses. It's got huge similarity, this SARS-CoV-2, to prior coronaviruses. So our immune system has many mechanisms to react. But around 1 in 5 people, or 20%, will be less cross-immune, and they're the ones that it has to go through. But in any case, as it goes through those people, you get the sad passing of the susceptible, and you get the majority of the people who are susceptible to infection become infected, and then the virus has much more difficulty and stumbles over immune people all over the place. So you get the turning of the curve, and this is entirely normal, and then it comes down in the Gompertz fashion. So just to show for influenza, here's a publication in the last 10 years about the Spanish flu, and you see the classic Gompertz curve as well. So this is entirely kind of normal, if you will, for a new virus that comes along. Now, we're going to look at all-cause deaths, excess deaths in respiratory seasons over the last couple of years. And this is from Euromomo. It's very important to look at excess death because the measure of cases or infections depends on how much testing you're doing and how good the test is, and it's really noisy. So death is the best measurement. Euromoma has 360 million people in the countries it tracks, and we're going to look at 2018 excess death. And as you can see, it's here, and you can integrate or add up all of the weeks of death and get the totals. So we did that, and approximately 140,000 excess deaths in the over 45 years of age bracket, which is the one of interest. So 140,000. It seems like a lot, but remember that's out of 360 million people. So it's actually a very small fraction. When we move on towards 2020, we note first that 2019 had a very soft flu season right up to early 2020. So we really had a lot of people built up here who would otherwise sadly have passed. So when COVID seasonally struck, there was a lot of dry tinder is one term that's being used. All those aged, susceptible, comorbid who are around to sadly be hit with the coronavirus. And the total, if you add it all up in this curve, is around 180,000 people. So you'll note that it's not much different than 2018, and we really didn't do anything in 2018, although some hospitals were overflowing in UK, for instance. But generally speaking, the difference is not great. Now, some people may comment that, oh yes, but we did lockdowns and masks and things this year. But they have been shown to have very little impact in analyses. So we're going to look at that. So this is a fair compare. And actually, the impact of 180,000 is lower than the year 2000 for excess death in the season. So the main difference is that Corona, the season was very short and sharp because of the soft prior season and other factors. It dramatically occurred in 6 weeks, these excess deaths, rather than around 4 or 5 months. So that's one big difference. So Explaining this, why were the deaths not much different than 18? Well, one reason is that the modelling was catastrophically high in its estimations. So here's one report that shows what was modelled by Imperial College and others for Sweden with no lockdown and with hard lockdown. And as you can see, the actual death impact is down here in the blue, and it's around 10 or 15 times lower than the modelling. And remember, Sweden had no lockdown, no masks, and even had hairdressers, bars open, little bit of distancing, but they allowed crowds up to 50 as well. So clearly the modelling was catastrophically high, and that's one explanation. Another study here pulled out by CoronaPogue on Twitter, and you can see here for different amounts of lockdown, from no lockdown down to super hard lockdown, there's huge numbers predicted for Sweden, but the actual was less than 6,000. So again, the modelling out by a factor of 15 plus, and that's what threw the world into turmoil. So here's another view of Sweden from Johan Hellstrom, done some great analysis, and as you can see, they had their epidemic which waned, and now all during August, tiny amounts of ICU and mortality. And they had 16-year-olds up to 16 going to school all during the epidemic, no masks, and very mild distancing and some other measures. But they just went through this classic Gompertz curve regardless. Opening up in the summer, nothing's happening. Pretty much community immunity established to an effective level, and that's pretty much how it's always been with these epidemics. So that's Sweden. Just to show you another cut in Sweden, because it's topical, Johan, I think, pulled this out as well. And out of the nearly 6,000 mortality in total, only 870 were directly caused by COVID with no other comorbidities. And obviously the average age was way up in the 70s too, and mostly care homes. But this red curve is the most direct no comorbidity curve for mortality, and it's clearly massively smaller than the curve that you see given around to the world. Sweden, another perspective from Johan, and this one is really interesting. He's pulled out all the data from the Swedish records, monthly death rates, and it's deaths per million, so it's corrected for population size, because clearly over 150 years the population changed a lot. So let's look and see, what's this spike here? Looks pretty huge. Well, that's the Spanish flu spike, and it is actually quite huge. It was a once in a century or maybe a few centuries event. But if we look down on the right, we're wondering, well, where is corona? Because we have the data now and the spike is over for corona, or SARS-CoV-2. And actually, here's the corona spike. So that should put things in perspective. It's not much different, like for all of Europe, actually, I showed you earlier, not much different than certain months in the previous 10 or 20 years. So that's really what's actually happened in excess mortality. PLC pulled out some great data. Everyone should know about this, and it speaks to why Sweden would have been higher than other countries, particularly the Nordics. So you can look up mortality.org, but here's the graphs. So we see the Netherlands had a particularly soft prior season with a kind of a trough of less than expected or fewer than expected deaths, 19 through to early 20. And Netherlands got hit quite hard then with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID, understandably, because a lot of people had built up who would have been very frail and otherwise probably would have passed away before. We see the same for Great Britain, a huge trough here and then a nasty spike when Corona came. And we see the same for Spain, pretty much. So this pattern is repeated throughout nearly all the countries. But let's look at Sweden. We see that Sweden certainly had a large trough. In fact, I think nearly 4,000 less than would usually occur. And interestingly, that's most of their spike when COVID came along. Okay? So let's keep Sweden here and now look at the Nordics that we have data for. I wonder, do they look different, right? Independent of lockdown. And sure enough, very different looking graph. They had normal enough death rates in the prior years. And again, they had a low spike for COVID. And Norway similar to Finland, very different than Sweden. So this is most likely the biggest factor driving Sweden's numbers and most countries' numbers actually, independent of lockdown and distancing. I have a gap here and I don't have Denmark, so I'll just drop in Hungary. You can see they had actually quite a above average mortality the last couple of years and almost no impact from COVID, which goes in line with that. There's other analyses done, like David Spiegelhalter here, an analysis of severity of prior flu season versus how hard COVID hit in deaths per 100,000. And as you can see, countries that had more severe prior seasons had very low COVID impact. And conversely, countries that had soft prior seasons tended to have high COVID impact, as you would expect. And finally, a publication just out, 16 possible factors for Sweden's high COVID death rate among the Nordics. And the lockdown differences are kind of number 16. And this team from the analysis say they're the least part of it. Their number one is the dry tinder situation in Sweden, as we just discussed. And they reckon it could account for up to 50% of their total death toll. I'd guess it's quite a bit higher than that. But they have another 14 reasons. Lockdown is in the halfpenny place, as we say in Ireland. Okay. Carol Hennigan, Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University, asked a great question quite a while ago. There's 50,000 pubs almost in the UK, and let's say 1,000 a week through the door. They've been open for a long time with no masks, right, and token distancing. That's nearly 300 million people interactions in 6 weeks. Now, it's nearly 500 million now because it's 3 weeks later than this tweet. So how many outbreaks occurred with nearly 500 million people in pubs with no masks moving around indoors? Well, let's take a look at the UK's actual mortality impact. Here's where we're talking about, where the pubs are open with no masks, basic distancing. So let's see what happened. 2 months or more, actually, 9.5 weeks since this began. Interesting. So not only is there no spike whatsoever, but quite the opposite, that during 10 weeks of this reality, right, it just kept falling. And that's because these curves are baked in, essentially, as we've discussed earlier. Community immunity, the passing of the susceptible, the seasonal changes in the virome and other factors dictate this curve. And we humans trying to do fancy things that were never tried in history, often that just doesn't work or do anything. So there you are. So any pub owners in Ireland watching this, or the Vintners Association, should be asking the question, why the hell have we had pubs closed in Ireland for the past few months? And it would be a very good question, and I think we've answered it here. Bazuo Greengrove, I've probably butchered that, did a nice analysis. It's very busy, but I'll just go through the basics. He painstakingly pulled out the USA seasonal impact of prior flus like 57 and 68, 69 and 59. And he also did a 1942 one, which was huge impact. But the notable thing here is they all have the double hump shape, which I'm going to describe to you shortly. And COVID is here, and it's no different really than these prior ones. Lesser impact actually. But we never did any lockdowns and things before. We did it for COVID. But another thing he pulled out is that, interestingly, these red lines show the influenza and respiratory disease patterns across the full year from week 1 to week 52 in the USA and prior years. But he pulled out the influenza for this year, 2020. Now, this year had masses of lockdowns and masks all over the place, and that was a real unique difference with prior years. But notice in the tan space here, they got the exact same influenza and respiratory deaths as normal. So influenza and respiratory deaths completely ignored the lockdowns and the masks, which again is the point where we're trying to make. This is another view of it. This hump here in 2020 was the corona impact being inappropriately put into influenza and pneumonia at the start. But then they fixed that. And as you can see, 2020 influenza and pneumonia, no impact from lockdowns, didn't change the curve. And finally, I won't read this out, but I did this back in late April, early May, explaining all of the evidence against lockdown being effective. Many professors, universities have published now, and I'll just pull out a couple of interesting ones that are logical. The millions of grocery workers across Europe and the US, right through the epidemic, never mind now, had no mask, indoors, 8 hours a day. They were non-lockdown. The great unwashed people coming in and out all day long. They showed no signal for extra infection or mortality. The essential workers, same thing, no signal. And many countries have dropped the lockdown since even late April, early May, all the way through all across Europe, and the curves never stop going down. They never change shape. The lockdown effectively had no impact, even though the belief system is that it should. Sorry guys, science is tough that way. And last thing, there's a link here I'll put in the bottom of this video or in the first comment, and it's just a Dropbox where there's around 5 published papers on lockdown analysis explaining what I just said, and a few articles, though we're seeing many more, even in the Wall Street Journal now, slowly, reluctantly acknowledging that lockdown was a massive mistake and will cause far more death than it ever saved. Masks I'll mention briefly. I know it's a hot topic, but I go with the science. Here's a paper looking at 14 randomized control trials of masks and surgical masks in preventing influenza viral transmission, and no support for a substantial effect. Basically, all these randomized trials over many years. So the science of the last 40 years was unanimous, and the WHO right up until late 2019. No way were they worth using. They might even backfire. And it all changed in June 2020, and suddenly people somewhere, influential people, wanted everyone in masks. So, but I'd go with 40 years of science rather than a few weeks of questionable science in quotes. So that's just the reality with masks. Just to illustrate it empirically, here's Germany, mandatory masks came in, curve never changed, kept falling. Austria, mandatory mask came in, curve didn't change, maybe it went up a bit. Poland, mandatory mask came in, curve didn't change, the R curve. And we see this all over Europe. There is no measurable impact between mandatory mask orders whenever they come in and any impact on outcomes. Okay, so that's just the way it is. So sorry about that, but the mandatory and prison sentences and arguments with police and fines all around masks are very, very non-evidence based, bad science, and the empirical data reflects that. So sorry guys. Now, I'm going to just remind you now about 140k excess deaths in 18 across Europe, nearly 400 million people in the respiratory season, and 180 for this year. And we've just gone through why lockdown and other measures didn't really change anything. So this comparison is what it is. And it may surprise many people that this is it. Maybe it's around 30% higher this year than 18. And other years in the last 20 were higher again. And no panic occurred and no damage to our society. So there you are. Seasonality, very important, so I'm going to go through it with updated figures. Coronaviruses are sharply seasonal, super seasonal, like influenza. This has been known for a long time. It's being denied in the past few months for some reason, but it's been known. So I'm going to show you here Italy, deaths per million. March, April, it rolls up and down, independent of the lockdowns they tried. It happened. But look at Brazil and Peru, a longer, steadier rise. And interestingly, Brazil had no lockdown. President was getting abused for that decision. And Peru had a hard lockdown, military style, with mandatory masks and everything back here in March. Okay, and hard lockdown. But look, right? Peru, if anything, is worse. So this is just re-stressing the point about lockdown. However, there's something else interesting. I've left space here to the left. What about November 2019? Why am I interested in showing that? Well, because it's crucial. Because in 2019, in November, SARS-CoV-2 has been verified in human sewage samples, just like it has been for Spain and elsewhere in Europe. So this virus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID in some people, was circulating in the population in Brazil, back here, same as Europe. But look at the difference of the virome triggering, right? Totally different behavior. So the virome is complex, and it rises based on UV and humidity and human immune, seasonal variations, many things. And it just ignores the human medieval science interventions that we've done this year. Transmission of epidemic influenza, I'm going to put a link below. Highly recommend you read the PDF. Edgar Hope Simpson, a doctor who spent 50 years plus on studying all of what we're talking about and a lot more. And he certainly got into the whole seasonal aspect because it's huge. So let's use his knowledge and have a look at these countries. So we look back at Italy here, dramatically different than Brazil with no lockdown, Peru with a lockdown. But the big difference is these southern tropical regions, completely different triggering than the northern temperate. So we're going to bring in a couple of excerpts from Hope Simpson's graphs, and we're going to see here that for northern temperate, which is Italy and northern Europe, we've got a pattern. And we've got a pattern called out in his book for southern tropical. And if we match up those patterns approximately, we see a rather excellent match, which is exactly what you'd expect. So like I said, super seasonal. I wouldn't worry about where on the axis they occur in terms of exact month. It's more around the seasonal relative differences and regional differences, independent of lockdowns. Europe versus USA. So a lot of people asking about USA, and it is tough over there because while Europe is long finished with the epidemic, USA got a second kind of surge, and a lot of people are misunderstanding this. They think it's a second wave. It's not a second wave. So USA, if it was only Northeast USA you were looking at, which is seasonally, regionally like Europe, you see this in the data. It behaves just like Europe, and it's falling off or fallen off to nothing. However, this part of the curve is southern USA, and that's what's driving the extended hump. And this is the classic double hump we've seen for all prior influenza epidemics. This is actually normal. Even though all deaths are sad, it is fading, coming down now, which is good news. So a little more detail. I pulled the data from the US database, and I'm going to use the same scale here of deaths per million, up to 70. And here's Northeast. New York got hit really hard, of course, but the Northeast US, you've got the Gompertz type curve like Northern Europe. And that's because it's Northern tempered type pattern, Europe-like. When we look at the South, it's very different. Not only is it surging out here, right, in a different time frame, but overall the impact in deaths per million daily is massively lower than the Northeast, because these are the same scale. So this is northern tropical type pattern, and it's more like Mexico and desert regions. Midwest is actually more like northern temperate type pattern, Europe-like, or like Northeast America. And for comparison, you can see here spikes in March, April, comes right down. Obviously, there's lower impacts overall, but the shape is similar. And then we have USA West is more like the USA South. It's northern tropical type pattern, and you can see here rising in the last few months and then thankfully coming back down now, and again very low impacts compared to Northeast. So hopefully that helps people understand USA patterns. Now the case-demic I'm going to kind of roll to a close with. There's hysteria the last few months over the summer, even though I clearly showed in Europe that the epidemic was over since May. And the reason is because we're hyper-testing with PCR. So I'll explain that. So here you have the curves I showed earlier for Europe, and you see the epidemics come down. This was an epidemic, in fairness, And this is not an epidemic. Epidemic's over as we get out to June, July. However, if you kept testing with PCR and in fact increased your testing, you would find viral fragments, dead virus, people who recovered months ago who were asymptomatic. You'll find some positive cases, but there'll be very little impact. You'll have a case-demic. And that's the problem we're seeing in Europe over the past couple of months with stringent measures, draconian measures based on PCR testing. So this is a great post for you to get an idea of the problems with PCR testing. Just Google this term here. There's the link. Professor Carl Hennigan again goes through the challenges. If you hypertest with PCR tests, they find viral dead fragments. They don't find full live virus. They can't identify that. They're calling them cases when they get a PCR positive. They are not, mostly. A case is hospitalization with severe impacts, or Convid19, the disease. These are simply positive tests from a viral fragment test kit. They are not cases. So a lot of confusion. This is what causes a case-demic. So to show a few countries, Ireland, we had an epidemic, rising cases and fall, and we had deaths follow it, sadly. Older, comorbid, average age 82, median age 84. So yes, we had an impact. Epidemic ends, but now we test. We're getting PCR false positives, historical infections, some true positives, but the impacts are on the floor. So for Ireland in August, we had 700 cancer deaths, we had 33 suicides, we had effectively 0 COVID deaths on the record. So, but all people are talking about is COVID. They don't care about the suicides, the cancers, the economic catastrophe. People don't seem to care about anything, even though they don't realise the epidemic's gone. UK, briefly, I'll just show it's the same problem. Enormous cases, local lockdowns, nothing's really happening. Now, as we come into fall and winter, we will see a natural rise in the virome. We'll see influenza, we'll see more impacts in hospitals, we'll see SARS-CoV-2 rising again, but that will be more normal winter resurgent of influenza like prior years, I would say. Germany, same story, I won't read it out. Switzerland, exact same story. They brought in mandatory masks in these countries back here when the epidemic was already over. That doesn't affect anything. Spain is being called out as having a second wave in the making, and sure, the deaths are rising a little, but as we'll see, that's not unusual in Spain as they head into fall and winter. So there's pockets here and there, but there's only around 1 death per million people per day in Spain at the moment, and that's being seen as a surge. So it's vastly lower than when the real epidemic occurred. But this will probably grow, but that doesn't mean it's a second wave by any means. But you can see the enormous amount of cases here, right? Absurd. And then these very small impacts. And then we've got Netherlands, same story. And we've got France, same story. Talk of a second wave in France now just because hospitalizations have gone up a bit coming into the fall. But again, similar summary. And US, I'll acknowledge, as I already have, that because of the southern and western regions, they're virome triggered, so they genuinely do have, with extra cases, a rise in mortality, but thankfully that's falling down now too. So have we seen this before, like the case-demic phenomenon? And this is important. This is from a government document, and it shows the H1N1 swine flu, where there were actual impacts in 2009 in the winter, and people died, not nearly as many as were modelled. But a fascinating thing happened then. They brought out a rapid PCR test called Flu Chip, and they started testing like crazy. And all during that summer, when the deaths were gone from swine flu, there was a freak out with huge tests and all the media going crazy. But no one was dying. So that was a case-demic. And they kept pushing it even into the fall, right? But H1N1, there were no real deaths. It had passed in its first season, as mostly they do. But there was a case-demic going on and a lot of hysteria until eventually they gave up on it. Now, the interesting thing is there were no lockdowns or masks back here during this safe summer. And that may have helped the following winter season be very soft because you had a lot of community immunity develop over the summer, but without much death impact. So that point we're going to bring up at the end again in the context of Spain and see what it might mean. Last one on this, it just shows the UK, and here's the seasonal increases in mortality, perfectly normal with influenzas, and down here we have the testing. But in 2010, in the summer, they were testing like crazy because of the swine flu panic. So you see an enormous spike in cases, but actually the lowest death that summer of the past 20 years. So it shows you the danger of a case-demic. This article, very important to read to understand why case-demics happen and the driving forces behind them. So it's the German mainstream Spiegel newspaper back in 2010 did this article. It's comprehensive, and it really is a great article and explains a lot of what goes on when these things occur. So I recommend that. Now, another thing in terms of second waves in Europe and Spain and anywhere, it's important to note that, influenza are shown in the three curves here, and they do fall in the summer, and then as you get into the fall, and this is only August, you see that you start seeing more influenza. So this is normal, and the blue bars are coronavirus cases in 2020, and they're following a similar pattern. Yeah, so there's nothing too abnormal about this, and that's probably important to internalize. Okay, so that's just a point to note. The Spanish second wave I'll finish on, because everyone's fear-mongering about second waves, and nothing is impossible in science, in fairness. So here we show Spain again, and we show the huge up to 900 deaths per day at the peak of the actual epidemic. And then, as I described, community immunity, passing of the susceptible seasonal vectors, it fell right down to nothing. So in May, it was effectively gone. I think these deaths were added in from a prior period. So recently, there's been talk of hospitalizations, and indeed there's mortality. Now, this is with COVID as opposed to necessarily from COVID. So you got to be careful here. But there is a rise, and people are talking about second waves. But what I would suggest is a second wave, a true one, would look something like this. It would rise up and come back down again and be very impactful. But this kind of coming into fall increase is nothing like that so far. And I want to remind people of Euromomo, which is the mortality excess for all countries in Europe. And here's Spain, and you can see in 17, there's the big hump in excess mortality, and in 18, 19 was softer, right? And there's COVID, 2020. But let's look at 17 and bring it down here. And what would it be like if 2020 going into 21 was even like 17? So let's bring it down here and extend out the months out to March and scale it approximately. Well, Spain could easily be heading into this in terms of mortality. Right? But this would be actually normal. And in here, you're going to have influenzas found. You're going to have SARS-CoV-2 found. If SARS-CoV-2 dominates, then it may kick out the influenza deaths and they'll attribute more to COVID-2 and to COVID. But either way, this is coming anyway. So, we've got to be careful that this is not attributed to some kind of second wave if it does look just like pretty much like 17. But we'll see what happens, and we'll be watching the authorities on how they're reporting it. Now, there is one difference this year, however. Even though lockdowns and stuff don't really work, they could have an effect that's negative. They're going to cause way more cancer deaths from late diagnoses, way more, malnourishment and suicide and dreadful suffering and impacts due to destroying economies. And they're taking away our cherished freedoms and causing terrible societal impacts. So the lockdowns and all that are causing huge damage, and that's being acknowledged in mainstream media. But here's another potential damage. For the first time in history, based on poor science, we've been putting in draconian measures all summer. And that's the safe period where the virus can circulate with very low mortality, and you can build T-cell and build mucosal and build population community immunity. And that's going to tend to protect the old and the frail next winter. But we've kind of gone in and tried to stop it for the first time in history, right? So it could happen here, it's reasonable to hypothesize, is the winter could be relatively worse than it needs to be in terms of death and injury of the susceptible and the weak, the very ones we want to protect. So wouldn't it be ironic if actually what would have been a mid-range winter actually became worse because we had not developed the normal ancestral evolutionary summer period community immunity? Now that would be an enormous backfire. And it probably shows the potential dangers of doing things that are not scientifically based, like Sweden did it, doing things that are not based on good science and continuing them all summer, could have pretty terrible unforeseen consequences, in which case the people pushing this would tend to have blood on their hands next winter. So unintended consequences occur all the time, but they most frequently occur when you don't follow the science, the best science. That makes unintended consequences, damage, injury, and death the most likely, is when you don't follow good science. And to be quite frank, going into the winter now of 2020 and into the January of 2021 in Europe, this is actually what I'd have a concern with, that we squandered a summer where we could have had the normal evolutionary, relatively safe spread of this virus when people had high immune function, and just after the susceptible had already passed, right? A safe spread, if you will, right? And that may put the vulnerable at greater risk next winter, which, as I say, would be ironic and tragic. And you can add that to all the extra effects of lockdown, etc., and all the other problems which have been acknowledged all over the world now, in the media even. So I'll leave it at that, but I think it's a sobering thought, and I'm going to be watching like a hawk in the coming months for exactly what the winter rises and patterns are, and using our worldwide network of solid scientists to tie these things together and make sure that a truthful, fair narrative comes out from whatever we face in the coming months. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'll do another update shortly. Thank you. Thanks for listening, guys. And just a reminder that I do need support to continue putting together all of this content. And at patreon.com/Ivor Cummings, or for PayPal at tinyurl.com/Ivor Cummings, where you can do a one-off or a monthly support. So I'd really appreciate that, guys, and keep me getting the science out there and countering perhaps the more biased corporate type science. Thank you.